Good morning, everyone. My name is Kaylee Lauder. I'm currently a 3L here at Colorado Law. I'm the managing editor of the Colorado Technology Law Journal and also a proud two-time DC Summer Scholar. It's my privilege to introduce our panel on public-private partnerships and spectrum policy with panelists Ira Keltz, Hank Hultquist, Robert Alderfer, Shawn, Monisha Ghosh, and moderated by Chapin. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for sticking us out. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. So thanks for sticking with us to the end. And obviously, the most interesting and important topic of the entire conference, spectrum policy. Yes, I've got my spectrum bros in the audience here. Fantastic. Lots to talk about here. We're going to tee it up with a couple of very short talks. Instead of the 10 minutes that we've had in previous panels, we're going to stick with closer to 5 minutes, although we're not going to be too strict on that, to tee up a couple of interesting recent case studies where some authority has been devolved out of the national regulator for different purposes. And then we'll get into the panel discussion. So our first speaker is going to be Ira, I think, yes, on the case study from CBRS. And could you stand up to the podium, please? Sure.
All right. Thanks, John. And good morning, everybody. I'm really glad to be here. I do have to say before I get started, this is my first time here at the Silicon Flatiron Flagship Conference, as opposed to all the people I'm hearing. It's 15 times, 20 times, and it is fascinating, a really unique experience with the integration of industry folks and students, and I'm just having some great conversations and really learning a lot, even on the topics that I generally don't deal with. And in fact, the last panel got me thinking. So I'm an engineer. I'm the acting chief engineer at the FCC, but I've been told I play a pretty good lawyer. And thinking about that whole image likeness thing, and I'm wondering if my good friends who are actual lawyers, I'm open to a lawsuit at some point. So I'm starting to get a little worried. And so second, just a quick caveat. Any opinions I express are mine. I'm not speaking officially on behalf of the commission today. So with that, John did ask me to talk a little bit about our Citizens Broadband Radio Service, or CBRS. This is, I think, an interesting case in thinking about public-private partnership and how something has evolved from what I'll almost call a pipe dream in some folks at the commission's head to something that's become a reality and actually functioning really, really well. So just for background, because I'm not sure how many of you guys are spectrum geeks like I am, but the CBRS, it's a 3-tiered dynamic spectrum sharing system. And so what does that mean? So what we've done is we were trying to create the ability for the industry to have the ability to operate in spectrum that was already being used by the Department of Navy for radars on ships out in the ocean. And that created some interesting dynamics for trying to protect those radars that have very important functions from being interfered with, while trying to unleash open value from that spectrum, especially inland where the radars, there are no ships. So we have created this 3-tier system that has a protection scheme in layers where Navy radars get protected at the top level, as well as some existing radar facilities. And then we auctioned some licenses called protected area licenses. And these we auctioned in a portion of the spectrum to give slightly higher rights to folks willing to pay for it. And then general authorized access. And these are licensees that are analogous to almost unlicensed type use. If I buy equipment that operates in the band, then I can go ahead and use it. I don't need a license. I didn't have to go to auction. And then this is all managed by a database, a very sophisticated database called the Spectrum Access System. And that database, or there's actually several, that's where kind of this public-private partnership concept comes in. So when we started, this was kind of a concept very anathema to the Navy to the Department of Defense. They do not like to share their spectrum. And what we did is we spent a lot of time, a lot of work with the DoD CIO office, Department of Navy, and we got very lucky. Some forward thinkers in the DoD CIO office who worked with the industry, who worked with the FCC, worked with NTIA to change the attitudes of the existing folks who are very ingrained in the way that they've always approached things, to get this group together, the key stakeholders from the industry, both folks who are looking to use the spectrum, from folks who wanted to run these database systems, from the government stakeholder side, and kind of bring everybody together. And it took a long time. It took probably a year and a half, 2 years of a lot of hard work among everybody to actually start moving this forward. So, I was trying to look up, what is public-private partnership. I had to go through probably 6 websites till I found a definite I liked. Most of them had to do with finance, and the CBRS really didn't have to do with finance, but it more was the fact that moving something to the private sector that's normally a government function, right? So here the government, the FCC, NTIA normally does the spectrum management, but here, we've provided that spectrum management function to these databases, to these spectrum access systems or SASs, and basically provided them the set of operating rules that they need to follow to ensure this type of interference protection. And, I've got to say, to date, from what people thought was never going to work, today we've got, I think in 2021, we had about 130,000 devices. Today, I was looking from an NTIA report, and from November, there's over 400,000 devices operating. So we're seeing really tremendous growth in this area. And what it has allowed, let me step back. So what I should say is, when we were doing this, we also wanted to experiment a little bit and try to provide for a little bit different type of access. So we were looking at it enabling small cell, local area type of uses and providing opportunities for people who might not be your typical spectrum users. They weren't your carriers, your AT&T or Verizons or T-Mobiles, although some of them do operate in this band, as I think Shawn will let you know. Well, they have licenses. Hank, I don't think you do, but anyway. So what we've seen though is a really interesting dynamic and growth here in the types of applications. So one thing this did is ISPs, internet service providers, especially in rural areas, who generally always operated on an unlicensed basis using Wi-Fi to connect houses to the internet. Well, CBRS, because it's actually a licensed service and the database manages the interference, it actually provided for the first time spectrum that those types of companies can use, where they actually had some interference protection built in, which allowed them to modify their business practices and actually, in a sense, provide some guaranteed levels of service that you could not do strictly on unlicensed use. We're seeing a lot of private network growth. We're seeing a lot of IoT, Internet of Things growth. I think we're seeing all kinds of things happen here that was not necessarily happening in other spectrum, either using the unlicensed side because there is no interference protection, or on some of the other side because people just can't afford to go to auction to get that spectrum. So where does that leave us today? I think, I think the CBRS provides a really interesting model of, as I say, kind of a public-private partnership, maybe not the way we always think of how those governmental and non-governmental type things work, but it provides a really interesting framework that I think we can think about in other contexts. We can build on in other areas, potentially, where there's heavily encumbered spectrum, to look at, can we unleash some value from that spectrum for the private sector while still protecting government or federal interests, and I think we're going to kind of hear more about those type models as we go on. So with that, I think I'll end there, and so thanks.
All right, the other model we're going to hear about is Hank from FirstNet. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And really, thanks to the organizers for inviting me. I have attended Silicon Flatirons before, but it's been a few years, and it's really wonderful to be back. I guess the bad news for you all is that I wasn't their first choice. I'm here today talking about FirstNet because Jim Bugel, who has recently retired from AT&T, in the end could not make it. Jim knows 1,000 times more than I do about FirstNet, but the advantage for you all is I think I'm a little briefer than Jim. So since Jim wrote these slides, but he's not here, I'm going to treat them as advisory and really skip around to address three things. What is FirstNet? How does the public-private partnership of FirstNet and AT&T work? And something that I didn't know about until I listened to the presentations yesterday, and it occurred to me it's actually a useful thing to bring out. How did the FirstNet process include concepts of cooperative federalism? So let me jump through these slides. I don't know why Jim wanted a quote from Henry Ford. So this slide really lays out kind of a high-level timeline of how FirstNet came to be. And the idea of an interoperable public safety network really was born out of the tragedies of 9/11, when first responders from different public safety agencies and different jurisdictions found that they were unable to communicate with each other over their radios. And over a period of years after that, with some fits and starts, ultimately in 2012, Shawn corrected me on the name of this act a minute ago, the 2012 Middle Class Jobs Tax Relief and Job Creation Act gave birth to FirstNet, the First Responder Network Authority. In 2017, the Secretary of Commerce announced that the award for the that the contract to build the network for FirstNet had been awarded to AT&T. There followed a period where states had to opt in. More on that in a second. And ultimately, we come to the FirstNet being deployed, and now to the point where we have, I think, our CEO said last week at our earnings report that we have 6 million connections on the on FirstNet. So it's really grown from those beginnings to where it is today. Let's skip ahead to what's the partnership? What's the public-private partnership that happened here? Actually, before that, I'll talk about what is FirstNet. How does it exist? Yesterday, Alan Davidson mentioned that it's a public agency that sits within NTIA, and it has a board of directors that consists of 15 people. 3 of them are the Attorney General, the Secretary of Homeland Security, and the Director of the Office of Management and Budget. The other 12 are appointed by the Secretary of Commerce. The way the partnership worked when this deal was announced was that the authority would provide to AT&T the use of 20 megahertz of spectrum in 700 megahertz band, and provide $6.5 billion in funding to build the network. AT&T would then use that, would allow the FirstNet to operate on its infrastructure, valued at the time at $180 billion, and would also reinvest $18 billion more into the FirstNet network. AT&T then turns around and sells services to public safety users on FirstNet, and it also gets to use excess network capacity on the spectrum for AT&T's commercial customers. AT&T adopted a system of priority and preemption to ensure that public safety use would always supersede any commercial use of the spectrum of the band. So that's kind of the nature of the partnership. Next, I'm going to talk a little about the cooperative federalism aspect of this. The way this came to be was, as I said a few minutes ago, the Department of Commerce and NTIA and the First Responder Network Authority, they went through a process of selecting what entity would provide the service. And there were 2 entities that participated in that, one of which was AT&T. Ultimately, AT&T was selected. But after that, there then had to be decision by each state and territory whether to opt into the AT&T solution or to deploy their own RAN networks over this spectrum that would then be interoperable with the FirstNet core. And some states actually, I think at least 1 or 2 states actually had developed what I would call a contingency opt-out plan in case the governor ultimately decided not to opt into FirstNet. There was a plan B that they could pursue to do the RAN either on their own or through another party. But ultimately, all the states voluntarily decided to opt into FirstNet, and that's how we got to where we are today. So FirstNet, it not only is an example of a public-private partnership, it's also the rare example, I think we're going to find out as we go through our panel, of an instance where we had actually a federalism component to a spectrum decision. And with that, I will stop my presentation.
All right. Thank you, Hank. Okay, so we're going to jump right into the panel here. You've got our biographies in your brochure, so we don't need to go into that. But just delighted to have a really broad spectrum of perspectives and backgrounds here, and super level of expertise. Actually, there's one more person that hasn't been thanked yet this week, which is Lisa, our photographer. Yay! She is apparently also a rock and roll photographer, so I'm sure she's making us all look really cool. Yeah, but anyways, so let's get into it. The first question we're going to discuss is we've just had two examples, which were really some of the best examples that we were aware of, where the national regulator was devolving some authority outside of its purview to help conduct operations in this modern complex spectrum environment. In neither case was the spectrum regulatory authority devolved to states, or indeed on a geographic boundary. So the first thing to discuss is sort of why that's the case, why we're talking about public-private partnerships and not federal-state partnerships, which was really the focus of yesterday's discussion in many contexts. We have multiple people here who have different perspectives on this, but I'd like to start this question, and for each question I've got somebody identified as the first victim. In this case, it's Monisha. Please lead us off.
Thanks for that. It's a pleasure to be here. I was at a Silicon Flatirons conference a few years ago, and it's one of the few places where as an engineer, I'm kind of in the minority, and I don't play a good lawyer, as my lawyer acquaintances will tell you. So when I was asked to look at this question, the first thing that strikes me is electromagnetic waves do not understand federalism, right? They don't stop at state boundaries. They go where they need, where the physics of electromagnetic propagation takes them. So it is, on the other hand, you do have continents like Europe, where you have a lot of countries that are, some of them are not much bigger than the states that we have in the US. And each country regulates its own spectrum. So clearly, one could, if they really wanted to, have states manage their spectrum. But the question is that a good way to go? And I honestly don't think it is. If you really want to manage spectrum differently from what we do now, which is at the federal level, other aspects could be considered, things like local licensing. So many times there are specific areas, and it doesn't matter whether it's in one state or another. It could be bridging two states. For example, oil fields that are very remote, and they would like to put up their own network to suit their purposes. Can we figure out access mechanisms so that they can get local licenses? And actually, CBRS is a great example of how that has been enabled. As Ira explained, because you have this third tier GAA licensee where you can actually get the right equipment. You still have to consult the SAS to make sure you're not going to interfere with anybody else. But it allows you to deploy networks and control them yourself. In fact, other countries have taken this lesson. They don't have the same sharing scenario that we have in the CBRS band with Navy radars, but Europe and Canada and UK, they have all started looking more carefully at the local licensing model. So while this is not really federalism, I do think there is a growing appreciation that there should be some amount of spectrum available that is managed or allocated in a different way than we are used to, which is, the big buckets we're all used to is unlicensed Wi-Fi and licensed, which is these two guys on either side of me. How do we get to a place where small businesses and smaller entities, school districts, have access to spectrum that they can control and deploy?
If I could add to that, John, I agree with you, Monisha, in terms of the role of states. As a communications service provider, we think about scale on a national basis. We operated in 41 states at Charter, and we think that scale is generally adds value to the communications business. And so if we think about fragmenting band management authority or authority over spectrum, that tends to add complexity and cost to operations. But I would note, setting aside the governance aspect of this question, there is certainly an interest by state and local governments in allocation of spectrum. And I would point the group to some data from a market research firm called OpenSignal, who runs a software development kit that lives on a range of applications in iOS and Android, doing performance data. So they have a very bird's eye view of how people use their mobile devices. And they've reported that 90% of mobile use occurs indoors. So that's homes, offices, campus, environments like this. And so setting aside the governance issues, and maybe we should look to some of the local licensing aspects that you were talking about, Monisha, but there certainly is an interest from state and local perspective in economic competitiveness and enabling appropriate spectrum use.
John, if I can.
Everybody.
I think maybe it's helpful to take a step back and frame the conversation a little bit when we're thinking about federalism and spectrum. I think what you're hearing from a lot of folks up here is the questions about the management of spectrum, the policy of spectrum, the access models, the who should get rights, when, where, how, whether it's licensed, unlicensed. I think those are fundamentally federal. I think, Christopher, you said it yesterday in the very first panel, spectrum is federal. And I think that's right. I don't think you can have a model that serves effectively consumers, the public interest in having mobile connectivity, home connectivity, unlicensed, licensed connectivity, whatever connectivity that you want to get out there in the ecosystem, doing that on a state-by-state basis. There would be capacity concerns, there would be, interference concerns, and all sorts of things. The federal government is uniquely suited to be able to answer those questions. I do agree with Rob that there are larger questions about assignments and allocations that get deeper into questions on what type of access model is the best in a certain case, and we're going to play that out on this panel over the next, hour or so. And we all have different perspectives, but that's where the rubber hits the road and you have the stakeholders engaged. But it's not at the management level. It's not sort of setting that policy, because that really is functionally national. And you can devolve that down in different license models and things like that, but you're not going to be able to set an effective spectrum management policy and get the sort of networks that you want and everything by doing it on a state-by-state basis. What you're going to hear, though, is a lot of talk about coexistence today. And I think that's where these interesting public-private partnership conversations come in, because the challenge that we're facing in certain bands at certain times is how do you accommodate functionally, different uses in a band. From Verizon's perspective, I think what we prefer is to sort of do a two-stage conversation about how you deal with coexistence. Stage one being, do you really need coexistence at all? Are there opportunities to move systems out of a band? Are there opportunities to take those conflicting uses out and, open up a band for more commercial opportunities? We prefer licensed, but we also use CBRS and unlicensed and all sorts of things. And then once you get past that first stage, then it's a question of what does that coexistence model look like? And CBRS is one great example of how you deal with that coexistence. And I think we'll unpack that a little bit more. But I think it's helpful to think about this rubric and the conversation that we're going to have in that way, because I don't see as a carrier how we could really deliver mobile connectivity if we had to go state by state and do different allocations and coordination. I just don't see how it would work.
Yeah, if I can maybe chime in a little bit. So in picking up on a couple of those themes, being the national regulator and looking at this, and just from my own experience, as Monisha talked about some of the border issues, and from somebody who works on our team that works with our colleagues or counterparts in Canada and Mexico on border issues, it's really complicated, and it could get and if you start trying to do that at the borders of all 50 states, plus our 2 national borders, and then, at what point, if there's no consistency, then how do the carriers or any other spectrum user know what they need to comply with? It's easy, I guess, in the middle of the state, but as you get towards the edges, and as we know, you get areas where a lot of population near state borders, and then even, what are we talking about? Are we talking about just the carriers, or think about public safety systems and mutual recognition agreements? Think about the New York tri-state area. You got Connecticut, you got New Jersey, you got Manhattan, and New York there. A lot of population density, and all of the public safety agencies there have mutual agreements. And if they start having to comply or need to comply with different standards, how does that work? And we do a disservice to being able to provide public safety. I could go on and on like this, but but I do think, as I think Shawn mentioned, as Rob did, there are opportunities to think about within a national framework for the spectrum allocation and uses, maybe different ways of enabling different types of users in different areas where it makes sense, because you can. The needs in Manhattan, in a very dense urban area, are very different than when you go out to the Midwest, where you have farming communities and very widespread area, and the farms and the farmers have different communications needs. You could you could speculate that we could create regimes that can cater to those different needs. And the states, local areas, I think, could have a role in helping the commission to figure out what types of things we might want to enable in those areas, but it's got to be done under this kind of this national framework. Because the other part of this becomes, I think, the equipment market. And, the one thing that both providers want and equipment makers is they need predictability. And if you're going to provide equipment that is affordable and not trying to build a different radio for 50 different radios for 50 states and national markets and whatnot, you've got to have consistency across the board. And so, again, I think there's room for flexibility within the framework that the commission has been operating under.
I was discussing, thanks folks, I was discussing this panel this morning with Dale, and in his usual way, he very gently pointed out that we were missing part of the spectrum management equation. We were looking entirely at the allocation and assignment and the rules, but what about the ex post enforcement? And Dale pointed out that we don't have a lot of resources right now at the federal level for enforcement, and maybe there'd be an incentive for states if we empowered them to enforce those federal rules. Maybe they would like to make their business climate better by providing fast interference management. I wonder if any of you have any comment about whether there are pros and cons of devolving that particular responsibility.
I can take a stab at it.
Yeah.
I absolutely agree with Dale that we have almost no understanding really of how spectrum is being used and where it's being used. We know where it's been allocated, and this goes for federal spectrum as well as commercial spectrum. And devolving that either to the states or even more final than that, to local communities, that do you really understand, what has been deployed in your neighborhood in terms of cellular services, in terms of what you have available on Wi-Fi from networks. And again, as a researcher, that's something I think about a lot, and we do a lot of our own measurements to really tease apart all of these effects of, especially with CBRS, and when you're trying to share spectrum. The very first step of, understanding spectrum usage is not there. And once you understand that better, then you can start enforcing that, hey, you're supposed to be deploying such and such system on such and such band here, and we've done these measurements, and it's not there. And that's when the enforcement comes in. And then there's, of course, enforcement when there is illegal use of spectrum or jamming or creating unwanted interference, which there is an enforcement bureau in the FCC, which I understand is very understaffed. So those are definitely, very important issues that could go down to a local level or a state level.
So let me jump in for a second again. So in a sense, the commission, we've already done some of this. So, for example, in the private land mobile realm, which is your public safety radio, your walkie-talkie types used by railroads or used to be used by taxis, businesses all over the place. We have a frequency coordination scheme that's been privatized. We have frequency coordinators, and the commission actually has an MOU with the coordinators to be the first line of interference mitigation. So if users who they serve are having an issue, usually they go to the coordinators first because they've got a picture of the local operating environment, and they've been very successful in being able to fix those issues before they come to the commission. It's been very successful. We've done that in some other realms too. Then you get into, I think, some of the bigger national carriers, and also, they have some of their own folks who try to resolve issues, because if it comes to the commission, it's usually gotten to a point where things are really bad. Folks, if they can avoid the commission coming down on them, would prefer to do that and solve things on their own. We certainly get involved when it involves, public safety, aviation, and things of that come to us immediately. But so we already have kind of an enforcement regime that is partially, in a sense, localized. And then to Dale's soapbox of effective enforcement, getting back to the CBRS, we have the SAS, the Spectrum Access System database, and that, in a sense, is an enforcement mechanism in and of itself, because that has a picture of what's happening across the board, and and the concept is, it can adjust the operating parameters of the radios that it is connected to ensure that folks are operating both within the rules and avoiding causing and or receiving interference. And to date, there's been no instances of harmful interference that have been reported within the CBRS. I should have mentioned that when I was speaking earlier, but one of the things that this did, and I failed to mention earlier, is part of why this public partnership, so to speak, or has been successful, is it provided a couple things. It provided a lot of predictability for the users, provided that effective enforcement, but it also provided flexibility that as we learned, we were able to evolve the system, because it just makes all you got to do is change some parameters in this database to modify things. And one of the things we did learn was, because there were no instances of interference, it seemed we were way too conservative on our assumptions going in, and we modified the propagation models, in some cases by up to 40 dB, by taking into account actual clutter that we learned about. And it created opportunities for 70 odd million more people to get uninterrupted service. Because what that SAS would do is, if it knew that there was a Navy radar, it would actually shut systems down in an area. By modifying the system under this flexibility, we were able to modify those zones where things got shut down to provide a lot more interrupted service. So it's kind of a way of providing service, building that enforcement in at the beginning, and doing it kind of on a localized level. So, and it's been real successful so far, I think, as far as that. In enabling that to operate.
Anybody else on this question before we go forward? Yeah.
Real brief, just to jump in on a point that Ira made earlier. Really, the most frequent and harmful kinds of interference we tend to see are the border, the international border issues that we see, either because in some cases, like with Mexico in 700 megahertz, they adopted a different band plan than the U.S., and that's created issues. We've also seen from Mexico from time to time the operation of certain kinds of jamming equipment that goes across the border and interferes with our network. The FCC has been a great partner in identifying the source of these problems and working to try to find resolution for them. So I think any way we could find of ensuring that the FCC has adequate either their own resources, or if they could find a way to devolve resources to other agencies in cases where it's necessary, I think those are very valuable things worth thinking about and pursuing.
That's great. Thank you. Okay, so next we're going to switch gears. We've been talking a little bit looking back. We're now going to switch and look a bit forward and talk about what might happen next. So I'm going to give you a term. The students can write this down for their next exam. The term is band manager, which is a generic term for an entity that performs certain spectrum management functions for a band that was delegated from the regulator. So, for example, in the CBRS band that we've been talking a lot about, the companies that operate these spectrum access system databases are performing certain band management functions. So I'd like to look forward, and this question is going to start going to Rob. You know, when we look at upcoming opportunities, whether it's a band situation or a national spectrum challenge, what's the next situation where a federalized approach or a public-private partnership approach is likely to be used, and what options might be available for how band managers could work in that environment? Start there.
Sure, thanks, John. And so maybe it's useful to start with an explanation of why that role is important. I think to understand that, you need to grasp two fundamental facts. One is that demand for spectrum is increasing across both commercial and government uses and systems. And second, that all useful spectrum to meet those demands is already allocated today. So if you start with those facts, it quickly becomes obvious that to increase the intensity of spectrum use to meet these growing demands, we need a partnership between stakeholders in order to do that. And that typically takes the form of sharing of spectrum, and that can be done in the dimensions of geography, frequency, and time, all three or some subset. And as we think about how to go about designing workable solutions that a band manager or others might implement, I think it's useful to abstract maybe from the CBRS use case and think about what are the features that worked well in CBRS and in potentially some other cases we can look at that can be applied to future spectrum opportunities. And I would think about those key lessons learned as perhaps in three categories. Three features that I think can be applied going forward. One, I think it starts with a technical partnership to really understand the risks around as we look to increase intensity of use in a particular frequency band. What are the risks of doing that? That typically takes the form of assessments of harmful interference, meaning two systems that are incompatible, their radio signals are interacting in a way that damages the system performance, or one or the other or both of those systems. And truly grasping that at a fairly detailed technical level is an important starting point. And that was done in CBRS as we looked at the federal uses of the relevant frequency range, the Navy operating along the coast. That led to some workable solutions. And that's really the second part, is once you understand the risks, you can design workable solutions. In this case, it was a spectrum access system for CBRS that can manage commercial use so that when the Navy pulls into port at a particular area, we ensure that the frequencies they're using are not used by commercial users that potentially could interfere with their systems. And then the third, I think, key feature of any band manager or sharing regime is just ongoing operational partnership. So once you design these solutions, you need an ongoing process to make sure they're working and to tweak them. And we, again, saw that with CBRS, as Ira described, in terms of recent applying lessons learned to some recent changes to the band to increase commercial use without doing any harm to federal users. So those three features, I think, are probably common in any forward-looking opportunity. We also saw them in another frequency case study in 6 gigahertz, which the FCC made available for unlicensed use in Wi-Fi in 2020. That was the product of, again, technical partnership to understand the risks of opening that band. Then designing workable solutions. In this case, it was a set of technical rules that governed indoor use and a separate set of rules that governed outdoor or standard power, higher power use. And then ongoing maintenance and monitoring of those frameworks. So as we look to, I think those two case studies, CBRS and 6 gigahertz, were both very successful in opening up new commercial uses. And as we look to future spectrum opportunities, there are two bands that are of particular interest and are at we're advancing along the path of understanding the technical risks and moving to workable solutions and ultimately, hopefully, operational coexistence. And that is the lower 3 gigahertz band. So this is in the same neighborhood as CBRS, and so is of high interest for increasing shared spectrum and mobile spectrum use. And the 7 gigahertz band, which is next door to the 6 gigahertz band that I was describing. And those are both in the process of collaboration between the federal incumbent users in those frequencies and industry stakeholders to really understand the technical risks of opening up those frequency bands to new commercial uses.
John, can I respond briefly? I just want to talk a little about what Rob was talking about in terms of the lower 3 gigahertz band, because that's a band the wireless industry is also very interested in. And in terms of its neighborhood, it's in a much closer neighborhood to the licensed operations at 345 than it is to the CBRS operations at 355. And I think things we're learning in 345 could be very useful to thinking about coexistence below 345. We have deployed 345 very widely, coordinating with the military systems that operate in that band. We have also been working on developing much more sophisticated coexistence capabilities with some of the defense companies that operate systems on behalf of the military. And I think you're going to see over time that those capabilities, for instance, as Rob referred to, time-based sharing, we've developed a protocol for time-based sharing in one of our markets with a defense contractor that is very successful in getting more use out of the spectrum, such that when the defense contractor needs to operate their system, they're able to operate. When we need to operate, when we're providing our commercial service, we get to operate. And interestingly enough, we did this purely on a bilateral basis. There's no third party standing in between us. And I think this can also be an excellent model for thinking about both lower 3 gigahertz and other places in the spectrum.
Truly cooperative management.
Yeah.
Shawn?
And John, if I can, maybe it's helpful to think about the terminology a little bit here because it gets blended a little bit. Sharing of spectrum does not always require coexistence in a spectrum band. Coexistence in a spectrum band requires sharing. So Rob set out a very good rubric for understanding sort of the different ways you can share spectrum or different access models. But geographic sharing, for example, does not require coexistence. You can actually have zones around key facilities or something like that within which you just can't transmit. AWS-3 is a band that's lower down from the mid-band, but it went through a lot of work in the 2010s around geographic sharing where operators were allowed to use those licenses, but we had to essentially direct our systems away from certain military bases and things like that. That's not coexistence. When people talk about coexistence or when we're talking about sharing, a lot of times they're talking about what's called dynamic sharing, where we're, like I said before, where we're talking about mutually exclusive uses in a band, trying to figure out how to use that spectrum all at the same time. And that's where spectrum access systems and things like that help us figure out when you can use it, what needs to be protected where, and everything. But this is why I want to come back to the comment I made earlier, which is I think sometimes we jump ahead and blend coexistence and sharing in an unhelpful way when we're talking about spectrum. And that's why unfortunately, I'm reflecting a little bit in my head on my old law school training and a doctrine that no longer exists anymore. Thanks, Loper Bright. But for those of you who are lawyers in the room, remember Chevron step 0, before you ever got to the questions of whether the agency properly had properly interpreted the law and what deference it got, you had to look sort of and get a grounding in the statute and figure out, is there space here to do anything? That's sort of what we advocate oftentimes when we're looking at new bands is we all need a better grounding for what the systems are, what the opportunities are to explore what we think of as static sharing models if we need to. That sort of geographic isolation. Or channelizing systems, decreasing operations to smaller channels or compressing, just simply moving them out of part of that spectrum, and other options that might be on the table that don't get us to these dynamic sharing systems. Ultimately, we may reach a point, as we did in the CBRS band where we have a Navy radar system that there's nothing you can do. It is just going to always be there. And if you want commercial operations in that band, you've got to figure out a way to dynamically share that. You've got to figure out a way to coexist. But I think far too often as we're looking at new bands, we default in the first instance to thinking that we automatically have to move to a dynamic sharing coexistence model without doing the work to justify that decision in the first instance. And I think for us, it's super important that we do the work at the beginning to make sure that we're there, because a coexistence model, and we can get into this in a minute, really does affect how the commercial operations in that band can be done. But I want to let others comment.
Thanks for that. I'll probably provide a slightly different perspective, because I agree we use coexistence and sharing interchangeably to mean the same thing. Looking at it purely from a technical angle, I like to, especially when I'm talking to my students, separate the two out. As sharing is when, so by the way, for me, sharing is same frequency, same time, same geography. If you're dividing up spectrum along one of these axes, it is sharing, but that is not the challenge we face right now. So if we consider that we're trying to look at what we can do in a band that is being used by multiple entities at the same time, in the same place, and the same frequency, then let's take an example of, say, Wi-Fi, right? Wi-Fi is doing it all the time. You know, all the folks sitting in this room, if you're connected to EduRoam, you're all coexisting. In my terminology, I like to think about coexistence is like users in a band. You know, there are protocols. Wi-Fi has a very, very good coexistence protocol that allows not only Wi-Fi, but Bluetooth and Zigbee and even cellular systems like 5G NRU or LAA to coexist without causing interference to each other. Sharing, in my mind, is when you have totally different systems that are trying to use the same band. So CBRS is an excellent example, and 6 gigahertz is an excellent example of where you had an incumbent user, and we were able to layer on additional use in the entire band without affecting the incumbent user at all, right? So that requires a lot more thought and understanding of what these incumbent user needs are, what their systems look like, and they're going to vary a lot band by band. And to me, that kind of sharing is where we are at now, because as Rob mentioned, every spectrum that people want, whether it's the military, whether it's the commercial folks, whether it's the radio astronomy folks, whether it's the weather satellite folks, I mean, we tend to kind of not think about all of the other users of spectrum whose needs are also growing. And so coming up with that is very important. And just one final comment is, if you think about sharing in that way, I think from a technical perspective, there are certain things that are really, really difficult to do. And I was talking about this in the last, social events that we had as part of this conference. As we were in these crowded rooms, there were many, many parallel conversations going on. And yes, it was a little bit hard, but it all happened because everybody was sharing that audio space because nobody was yelling. Nobody had a megaphone in the room dominating the conversation. So that kind of sharing, when you have very different kind of users coexisting in the same frequency, requires rethink about what kind of power levels do you end up using so that more people can use the same frequency without stepping on each other's toes.
Go ahead.
I think at the end, Monisha hit really an important point, that certain kinds of sharing, let's say Wi-Fi, for example, work very well with certain power levels, that at low power levels, lower power levels, you're able to coexist, share, whatever you want to say. It's not to say they don't interfere with each other. There may be occasions when they do, but they muddle through. They don't have an expectation that they won't be interfered with. They make it work. But we have other use cases, and AT&T, Verizon, we provide mobile service using a cellular network where the radio sectors cover, I don't know what the average is, but let's say 1.5 to 3 miles.
Yeah.
And the power level you need to do that, if you said, okay, we're going to let low power users also go in that band, they're not going to find it very good environment for them. Because the power levels we're operating at, in order to make it possible to provide mobile service, are not going to be power levels that they can easily coexist with. And that's just a fact.
Well, that's not completely true. I mean, we have ultra-wideband systems that operate throughout, and you don't even...
No, that's true. You could have some systems.
Right. It all depends on how you set the technical rules to enable. So, again, and, I agree with pretty much everything was said, but I am going to take a little umbrage at Shawn's mention of that coexistence and sharing are separable in a sense, that you can't have one without the other, because I don't think you can have one without the other. And I think your examples of, well, if you point your antennas a certain way, or you just serve certain geography and pull your emissions in, that's actually a coexistence technique. So in a sense, I mean, I think if we were to go to Webster's...
that is fair. So, I will admit to being a little reductionist in the analogy, but I do want to point out that...
Lawyer versus engineer.
Exactly. The point being that, when we're talking, I think a lot of times, throughout these debates, we do sort of begin to think that this dynamic sharing is sort of where we need to land in the first instance. And I think that's not always, I don't think we always do the work to make that. The other point I wanted to make, sort of coming off of what Hank and Monisha just said, is I think the other thing that sometimes gets forgotten is the consumer expectation on the other side. We talk about commercial use of spectrum, but not every commercial use of spectrum is exactly the same. And I agree with Monisha. In a crowded room, we all figure out how to share, but sometimes I miss words of the conversation. Sometimes I have to say, can you repeat that to me? Sometimes a packet drops, as Richard would say to us. But if someone collapses on the other side of that room and we need to get help to them, I sure want them to be able to shout and have that expectation that they're going to be heard across all of the room. And I think that's what Hank was sort of saying is, much as sometimes in the policy debates, we collapse sharing to mean a single thing. Sometimes in the policy debates today, we collapse commercial use to be the same thing. And we're all guilty of a little bit of reductionist thinking on that. Not to point too much of a finger at Rick Zimmerman and NCTA, but I will. Michael Powell sat in front of the House Energy and Commerce the other day talking about that Wi-Fi is the internet. In a sense, that's true. In a big sense, that's not true. Wi-Fi is a last mile connectivity to the internet, and it's an important last mile connection to the internet. But it's not the internet. I mean, Hank and I could probably sit up here and say that cellular connectivity is the internet as well. We have to go beyond sort of these one-liner talking points to really start to dig into what do we want the outcomes to be in a lot of these debates, and then start to really analyze how we get to those outcomes.
I'm going to jump in here because we've strayed fairly far from the main topic we're trying to address, and I think that I'd like to bring us back to public-private partnerships, and this will be sort of the last question from me before we go to audience questions, so you all might start getting there. But coming back to public-private partnerships, and especially if we're dealing with these sort of higher power cases or critical use cases that we're hearing about and so on, there probably needs to be some kind of coordination mechanism, maybe a band manager. And so for the folks in the audience who come from maybe a competition law perspective, is band management a natural monopoly? Do we want to do, does it make sense for there to be one entity doing this for a given band in a given area? And if that's not the case, so that question really goes to Shawn, but if that's not the case, and if it doesn't have to be a monopoly and we're going to have multiple ones, how would you sort of technically or policy-wise arrange things to make it efficient? And that question, Monisha can kick us off. So we'll get into that discussion here.
No, it's a really interesting set of questions. And one of the reasons John directs it at us is, it was sort of alluded to earlier, but I'll put a finer point on it. So Verizon does use CBRS in our network. We bought a number of priority access licenses at auction from the FCC. We also use GAA, the general access level, in many situations as supplements to our network. So what we have figured out is we can utilize, even with its limitations in power levels and scope and scale and things like that, there are ways we can actually integrate CBRS into our network as supplemental downlink. So extra downlink capacity, when you're pulling stuff off the internet. And it really does help in congested areas where we could utilize it. And we have worked over time. So I think Iris set this up really well. What the FCC did is say, here's what we want the spectrum access systems to do. We start with the idea that we need to protect the Navy radars. And then we go from that to how do you coordinate? You set the rules on how you coordinate between what rights a priority access licensee has in an area and what a GAA user has in an area and things like that. And then they sort of let it out, the FCC let it out into the commercial sector to say, if you can build a database that meets these sort of general requirements, we're going to let you pitch your services out there as a vendor to the folks who either have the priority access licenses or want to do GAA access to it. I think from Verizon's perspective, we think that's the right approach. Sort of let the marketplace evolve, let vendors develop their services as long as they're meeting the fundamental thresholds and fundamental requirements that the FCC has set for these band managers and spectrum access systems. That works for us. I don't think we think where we sit here today that it does reduce itself to a natural monopoly, because as long as you're really, the vendor piece of this comes down to that coordination between the priority access licenses and the GAA users and what channels you get and when and where and how you calculate the interference. And when I talk to our engineers who are far more sophisticated on this than I am, they actually don't see that it's a problem that sometimes maybe the spectrum access systems come out with different channels and different results, because it has to do with algorithms and things with how they implement the FCC rules, but we all make it work at the end of the day. But no, I don't think, John, we think it's a natural monopoly. The one thing, I'm not sure that I have a lot to say on looking at the spectrum access model system for CBRS, that we have a lot to say on improvements. I think we've offered some ideas to the FCC on ways to overall improve access to CBRS. We would love to see them raise power levels on transmission and let a third category of devices in that could transmit at higher power, rationalize out-of-band emissions with an adjacent band to allow dual use antennas to be deployed. We use a lot of C-band, which is the band right above CBRS. We would love to be able to integrate in a deployment to use one antenna that could access both bands. But I think we're fairly comfortable with the spectrum access, with the band manager piece of it. It's really the inputs into how they do the algorithms and how they do, the adjustments that have been the source of conversation at the FCC.
Can I just add one piece here, John? Hank, you mentioned earlier that low power usage in CBRS and 6 gigahertz has enabled compatibility with the incumbent systems in those bands. And I think that's a really important point, both in the case of, those specific frequency bands and their success that's played out in the market, hundreds of thousands of CBRS radios deployed, millions of 6 gigahertz Wi-Fi devices deployed with those lower power levels. The reason that's been true is because of the point I mentioned at the top of this, which is that most commercial demand is highly local in nature, right? It happens in a particular place at a particular time, generally indoors, and that offers a natural symmetry with the incumbent users of the band that may need to operate their systems at any given place at any given time across the country. To the extent that we can reduce potential friction points through low power usage, I think that's a good model to look at, not just for the bands that we're talking about here, but also going forward into new frequency opportunities.
I guess I just want to briefly respond to that, because it's true that there are things you can do with low power that you can't do, but that doesn't answer the question of what are the spectrum needs that you have. And so it's great that we can offload a lot of mobile traffic onto Wi-Fi. That doesn't mean we need more spectrum for Wi-Fi. Because of the low power nature of Wi-Fi, it's reused all the time. So having given set aside 1,200 megahertz of spectrum at 6 gigahertz for Wi-Fi, I guess I'm skeptical that just because it's easy to do something at low power means we should do more of it. Because the question we need to answer is, what needs do we have in the network for use cases? And I think believe me, AT&T would be thrilled if we could look out over the next 10 years and say, we're good. We don't have to go to auction. We don't have to buy any more spectrum licenses. We're good with what we have. That would be a great answer for our business. But what our engineers tell us is that's not the case.
Can I?
Yeah, please.
So a lot of points here that I want to respond to. So a few things, right? There is physics of propagation. And we've done a lot of measurements with real systems, not lab experiments. And even in the mid-band, even as you're going into 3 gigahertz, those signals are penetrating less indoors than, say, the 4G systems down at 1 or 2 gigahertz. And as you go higher, that's going to go worse. We just completed a paper where we did measurements on 6 gigahertz Wi-Fi, and there's at least a 20 to 25 dB penetration loss between buildings. So as we think about, and by the way, let me preface this by saying that I totally agree that we need these 3 buckets. We need unlicensed spectrum, we need exclusively licensed high-power spectrum, and I think increasingly we need shared spectrum that can coexist well with incumbents. The question in my mind is to really go back to use cases. The most of the use cases that we are seeing today are very much targeted to this. And those networks are actually not being able to serve a wide variety of really interesting use cases. For example, factory automation. If you want to deploy a cellular network inside a factory, and Wi-Fi doesn't work very well there too, because there's just natural, the Wi-Fi protocol is the quality of service is not as good as a cellular protocol. So if you want to deploy a cellular system inside a factory, your exclusively high-powered licensed spectrum doesn't help you there. You don't want a base station sitting outside your factory to control, the operations of machinery, because you've got to factor in this 20 or 30 dB penetration loss you're getting. So it's a much better use case to actually deploy a cellular network inside. And this is where this growing use case of private wireless is going on. There are many, many advantages to doing that. You're fair to low power, just enough to cover your factory. You're not interfering with an incumbent, maybe a federal incumbent who's operating radars outside. You can tailor that network totally to your purposes. Cellular networks today that are serving mobile broadband customers are downlink heavy. Their uplink capacity is limited with the TDD structure you use. If in a factory, everything you want to do uplink, you can do that, and you can manage your network. So as we think about use cases, I think as a community and as spectrum managers and, as researchers, we have to start thinking beyond what we always tend to focus on is, what did my speed test on my phone say? So I was at a conference once and somebody said that the biggest the killer app for 5G is the speed test app, because everybody's running a speed test to figure out, how much is 5G giving them. So, and going back to the technology question, I really think that given all of, and I will throw AI into the mix there, but we really are at a place where we can maybe, not even have band managers, but we automate this whole thing in such a way that you're sensing your environment, you're reacting to the interference that you're seeing, you're adjusting your power levels appropriately and creating spaces. And I'm not saying that all spectrum has to be that way. I cannot imagine if I'm in a rural road in the middle of nowhere and I want to, access the internet, sure, I need the exclusive high-power license network that AT&T and Verizon and T-Mobile provide. But we have to be more inclusive in the application space that we want to address with our future networks.
Okay, I'm going to jump in here. We do need to get over to audience questions. I will comment that as hard as we want to try to focus the conversation on public-private partnerships, of course, we're ending up back into all the spectrum policy debates that are central in DC today. So be aware of that. Yes, we've got to go to the wiser rule first. Let's find ourselves a student. We have one in the back there. Oh, she's got somebody. Maybe we'll take one and then two. It seems like we had two hands up. That's great.
Thank you. Hi, current master's student in electrical engineering. Outside of policy, what technological needs do you see, or engineering needs do you see in research or just current advancements for current spectrum sharing purposes outside of policy?
So I think there are one of the biggest, and I'll go to the public-private partner, I'll address that issue over here, is so much of the spectrum debates we're having now is you have a public entity, say a federal entity, trying to, say, share spectrum with a private entity, Wi-Fi or cellular or shared spectrum, whatever, right? The main things that we don't have very well today is very good understanding of what are the interference requirements. All our sharing systems today are open loop. So CBRS is open loop. The SAS makes a decision about whether, what power level should be allocated to a system based on its propagation model and its prediction, right? There is never the feedback that comes back from the incumbent about, did I get interfered with or did I not? So in the absence of that closed loop, most of our sharing systems are they're very conservative because we never want to cause interference. If we can figure out technologically how we can do better closed loop systems, so everybody is giving feedback as to whether they're being interfered with or what the level of interference is, what their quality of experience is, I think we could get to much better spectrum sharing regimes. It's tough, though.
Yeah, I just want to echo Monisha's point, and one she made earlier also, which is I think the areas where it would be great to have development are capabilities of detecting operations and automating a mitigation response to those operations so that you detect the operation and you know what you have to do. It's not necessarily, you have to shut down. It's, you can take these steps, reduce power by 2 dB, change your antenna tilt, by X degrees. And the ability to sort of fine tune that and to embed that into the coexistence architecture and the rights that the spectrum holders each have and understand their rights, I think that will really advance spectrum sharing, coexistence, whatever you want to call it.
I'll just comment in response to that question. I didn't introduce myself at the start. I'm at the National Science Foundation. I co-chaired an effort that lasted throughout 2024 to develop a national spectrum R&D plan. It was a collaborative effort across a lot of government agencies with public input. That came out in October, and it's available online. So for that question you asked, you have the sense of the U.S. government right there is available to you in a pretty current form. We had another question in the back from the other student. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Matthew. I'm a 2L here at Colorado Law. Just want to thank you all for being here. But I do have a question for Ira. You discussed briefly about the role of, I believe they were called MOU coordinators. Is that correct?
A memorandum of understanding between the FCC and, some frequency coordinators.
They were being the first line in interference mitigation, providing localized enforcement and often preventing instances of harmful interference from getting to the commission. I was wondering if you could speak to the structure of those in more detail and also speak to the shortcomings of them and what the logical next step is in a better enforcement regime.
So these were set up, so the private land mobile regime is vast. It encompasses a tremendous number of kind of disparate type users and similar. So it's public safety users, miners, taxi cabs, railroads, and the frequency coordinators. The commission has authorized this group of entities that we call private land mobile frequency coordinators that on behalf of the commission, anybody who wants to use those frequencies that are designated for those uses by rule do not apply directly with the commission. They have to use these frequency coordinators. So by virtue of that, these frequency coordinators have a very good view of what's happening locally that the commission doesn't necessarily have, because they have more information than we have, because they collect a lot more information than our licensing database does in order to do very effective coordination to make these systems work. Because one thing I should say is, as opposed to what the carriers have, these are not exclusive frequencies. All of those frequencies by rule are shared, and the operating premise is you need to be a good sharer. Listen before talk, or use other mechanisms to avoid causing harmful interference to other users on those same frequencies, because frankly there are hundreds of thousands of these users across the country. So because these frequency coordinators have this good viewpoint of what's happening locally, and because we have different frequency coordinators, we also have a rule that they share information. So they all operate from the same set of data, at least a common set of some data, so that everybody knows what's happening. Therefore, if there is an interference event, or one of the users does report they're having an issue, they have the immediate view of what may be happening, and can then go to those users, work with other frequency coordinators to try to resolve that.
Let me jump in here. We want to get to another question.
Okay, so I'll wrap it up real quick. Yeah. So what are the shortcomings? Well, we have, in a sense, deputized these folks to do this work, but when it comes down to it, how much legal authority do they have to force somebody to make a change? So that's where, they can do so much, but generally it works, because if it gets to us and then a formal proceeding starts, and then you can get fined or have your license revoked or other things, nobody wants to get to that level. So it generally almost never gets there. But the one place it could break down people don't necessarily have to listen to them, and then it escalates up.
Okay. Time for one more solid question. I don't know who to pick. Michael, you had your hand up right at the beginning. So I'll go to Michael Calabrese.
Right. Yeah, Michael Calabrese, New America. Actually, to tie this to the public-private partnership, I just wanted to note quickly one thing that I don't think came up, which is if we were in any other country, this conversation would be completely irrelevant, because I believe the FCC is the only national regulator that uses private band managers to manage on a more decentralized basis, and particularly these dynamic spectrum management systems you've all been hearing about, like in CBRS and now in 6 gigahertz. So that's a real tribute, especially to IRA's team and the Office of Engineering and Technology, that we have this going on at all. So my question, somewhat related, is that I think that last set of exchanges was implicitly raising another trade-off. I just wondering if you all have an observation or two about, when you think of use cases and needs for spectrum, they come down mostly to coverage and capacity. And there's trade-offs. So you need some spectrum for coverage, and then you need perhaps even a lot more spectrum for capacity, particularly where the users are dense, in cities and so on. And so, Shawn mentioned that Verizon deploys in CBRS. There's more than 1,000 operators using CBRS, but I believe Verizon is the biggest deployer in the band by far, but that's at a much lower power. So I don't know if you want to start, Shawn, or anyone, just to observe that it could be that as we need to share spectrum more and more, that there needs to be this mix and match on a power basis between, what do you need, what's enough for coverage, and when can you focus more on capacity and then squeeze more use at a lower power level.
No, and I'll start. I want to sort of note your first point, Michael, which is an important one, and particularly from our perspective. We do think the private band manager model is the superior model. It gives some sort of commercial check on the outputs that are coming out of the models. I know there's been some conversation about transitioning or in future bands moving to a government band manager model, potentially the Department of Defense or others. We think that's an inferior way of doing things, particularly when sometimes you have an interested party that's running the band manager system because they have systems that they're protecting. So I do want to sort of agree with that. On your point on power levels, look, I want to go back to something Monisha just talked about
30 seconds.
The feedback loop. I think where we come at this question of power levels and whatnot is we understand when you are in these sort of public-private sharing coexistence systems, assuming that we've done all the work to say that we need to be there, there may have to be adjustments on power levels and think about how all of that works together. What we would encourage, one, is for everyone to continue to have an ongoing conversation about that. That's why we like raising the conversation in CBRS about whether there could be a third, transmitter in there at higher power. Second, I think it's still a trade-off depending on what you want out of that, the capacity coverage thing. And for us, yes, we figured out how to use it. We're the largest deployer, but it is only one use case on our network. And if we see uplink going dramatically higher with AI systems and things like that, that spectrum's not gonna be well suited to deal with that new capacity demand. And then we're going back to sort of that dedicated license where we can control the uplink and the downlink and think about capacity in a different way. But I understand the point, and I do, we're there to have the conversation on these public-private models of coexistence, again, assuming we've done the work in the first instance to say that that's a justified outcome for that particular band or a portion of that band.
Thanks, Shawn. I want to give anyone else who wants to jump in
Can
on
I take
this.
10 seconds
Please
just to
do.
top up?
Yeah.
Michael, to your question, I think we've solved for coverage as a nation, and what we're talking about here in terms of meeting commercial demand growth is really a capacity question. And I would just point folks toward one case in point on that to bring the point home. The $500 billion announcement by Stargate around AI compute that'll be deployed in the coming years. Just think about the amount of data and traffic that investment will generate on top of the existing growth that we have. That is all going to land at the edge of the network on local networks, and that's really what we're talking about in terms of the challenge that we're facing.
We are out of time, I'm afraid. So let's just thank the panel. And panel, please stay where you are. In the interest of getting you all to lunch, we're going to just stay on stage while he does his closing. Thank you, guys. Yes.
3 points. Number one is I came to Colorado law in 2005. Basically, this was not my formal title, but I was a scrivener for a project known as XG. And that was so-called smart radios, which my friends immediately knew was those kinds of radios that can play while you're in the shower and get wet and continue to function. Wow, it's amazing to see this discussion of what we were doing back in 2005. Dale, Phil Weiser, Doug Sicker, Tim Brown was involved in that, and Peter Tenhula is here, who is super closely involved. And to see this conversation kind of comes full circle from my vantage point. Second, in the way of coming attractions from here, we're going to go upstairs. This is the end of the formal part of the conference, but this is a bit of a preview as to where we're going. We're going to have a space law discussion in room 204. There are so many important questions out there right now in space law and regulation. We're going to tee some of those up today. And by the way of previewing what's coming in Silicon Flatirons, look for a space law conference here in June of this summer, 2025. Second is we have our next major conference is going to be in the middle of March. It's going to be on AI and autonomy. Right on point in terms of several of the themes that have been called out in this conference. We hope that you'll return then. And more locally, in terms of the entrepreneurship scene, our next event is on February 20th, the Variety Show. If you're in the area and haven't been to one of those, super easy to recommend. Point number 3 is, Phil Weiser really kind of built this flagship as, by the way, I don't know if anyone's ever noticed, it's always between the championship games in the NFL and the Super Bowl and that dead weekend. And it really is kind of the Super Bowl of tech policy that Phil built over the years. And I view myself and our current team somewhat as fiduciaries and custodians of that tradition. I just counted up my notes. I got 16 pages of notes from the conference, was a pretty good sign that there's been some ideas flying around. Thank you to all of our speakers, our staff, Lisa the photographer, student volunteers, and crucially, each of you for coming and spending your time with us. I hope you'll come back and see us again soon. That concludes the formal part of our conference. Get some lunch. We'll see you upstairs in 2020.